Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Welcome to FDA Imports cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. He is the founder of FDAImports.com and a former FDA regulatory counsel who helps companies worldwide navigate the complex intersections of FDA oversight and international trade. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about the new era of supply chain transparency. Ben will explain how rules like the FSMA 204 and the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, or the UFLPA, are pushing importers to document where every ingredient comes from and to be ready to prove it to the government. Benjamin, sir, welcome.
Thanks, Evan. It's good to see you. Glad I could be here to help talk through some of these important issues.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk about the supply chain transparency 2.0, tracing every ingredient from source to shelf. Benjamin, what does a supply chain transparency mean for FDA regulated importers today? What does that actually mean to them?
Well, so everybody in the food supply chain is going to have some obligations under the FDA's new regulations, and that includes importers. Now, importers many times are companies that take possession of cargo, but they don't manipulate the actual food. They manipulate the boxes, right? They may break boxes up, and they may put them into smaller cartons for further distribution, but not touch the food. And in those cases, it's basically, who did you get it from? What is it? And where did it go? Now, for those importers that are performing any steps that relate to that result in touching the food, or any identifying information on the label, because the label has identifying information very often that's associated with traceability. Then those businesses are going to have a lot more documentation and data. And the primary issue is that the importance. It's about trying to give some muscle to tracebacks when there's a food event, right? When there's some sort of a recall, there's an outbreak, and depending upon what the product is, it could have very, very, very broad impact. Like, it could be something that's been distributed in 5, 6, 7, 50 states, or it could be something that's regional, but it's difficult to tell. And you don't want to use the number of people showing up in the hospitals as the way to figure out how widespread it is, right? You want to go find the food. And so the statute and the regs were designed in order to accomplish that. For importers, it's mostly going to be tracking data about who you got it from, and then what kind of conditions you stored it in and where it went, unless they do something with the food. If they do something with the food itself, then they're going to have additional documents.
So Ben, how did the new FSMA 204 traceability requirements change? Well, what supplement importers need to document before the products even reach the United States? How do we have these effective dates to worry about?
Sure. So the important thing here is that each of the entities, the businesses that are involved in the supply chain, are going to have their obligations. Importers are going to ordinarily be expecting that they can get some verification that their foreign suppliers have the ability to identify the raw materials going into the product. The importers will not usually have that data. They wouldn't get it. There's going to be some process that the importer is going to go through, some verification step in order to ensure that the ingredients are proper with respect to finished food. Now, if the importer is a manufacturer, then they're going to have to do what everybody else is doing, which is identifying the source of those ingredients. If there are kill steps in my process, let's say I'm bringing in a bunch of different ingredients and I'm going to make a frozen dinner where everything in the tray is already cooked, and you are going to go to the store, buy it, and stick it in your microwave, and you're going to eat it, and in your TV stand, you're going to watch Jeopardy, right? And so you're doing that. Well, that food has already been cooked, and so the expectation is that the manufacturer is going to have controlled any microbiological risk because they would have done it with their own processing. So the data that's before that is less important for that particular food, right? It's, the agency's looking to get back to the kill step because their expectation. Now, if there's a problem at that kill step, then that's probably the node, right? That's probably the root of the outbreak. So importers, depending on what they do, are going to have to either do some verification that their foreign manufacturers who performed the kill step before it got here have taken these steps, and they're in compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. And there's a program called the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which is going to build this record keeping. Basically, is going to be built into it. And then if you're actually doing manufacturing, then you're going to perform a lot of those steps with your inputs. You're going to know who you're buying ingredients from, and so you're going to require your suppliers to also provide some verification for their suppliers. This supply chain, isn't like from me to you to Heidi, right? It's going to go. There can be 10 of you and 3 of me, right? And then it gets to the manufacturer. So it's a more of a network than people call it a supply chain. It's a supply network in most foods.
Wow. So before we get into details regarding imported food traceability, do you expect traceability demands to expand in the future beyond food into other FDA regulated sectors like cosmetics, drugs, medical devices, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. The pharmaceutical industry already is, and medical devices, depending upon the risk that the device represents, already has traceability obligations with the finished products, but they don't usually with the active ingredients or the excipients, the inactive ingredients, or the components. Critical components of devices are going to also have some traceability, but not like we see right now with food. I expect this to grow without question in all of the FDA regulated spaces, simply because FDA is just getting around to this.
Wow.
The National Marine Fisheries Service was already doing this with seafood, imported seafood. So it's not that they were lazy. It's just that the FDA regulated industry is a large industry, and it affects a lot of districts, and consequently, it's very political. Right? Food regulation is very political. Because everybody is worried about the impact that something is, everybody in Congress is worried about the impact that a regulation or a statute is going to have on their constituents, which are at a certain place in the supply web, right? Very complicated. So it's hard to get sometimes good legislation out. And so it's not FDA's fault that it took time. But they are a little late to it. Other industries are already doing it. Many industries, the food industry already started to get into it before the requirements kicked in. So there was already a lot of technology that was coming out. So yes, this is going to grow, I think, without question, across the FDA's regulated space.
Setting the FDA aside, Customs and Border Protection is separately enforcing the UFLPA, which requires its own traceability documentation from raw materials and even service origins through manufacturing and exporting, looking back for potential forced labor and child labor risks in the supply chain. What is included in this forced labor, and do these two agency systems overlap in practice?
Yeah, good question. So this is a good way for us to talk about sort of the differences in the traceability program, because it arises out of the purposes for the program. So the food safety program is designed to provide a rapid traceback for identifying the source and the location of high-risk food that has been implicated in a foodborne illness or some sort of an outbreak, what they call an event, a food safety event. And it could be an outbreak in terms of salmonella, microbiological contamination. It could be some chemical. Right now, there's a lot of work being done with Indonesian products. Certain Indonesian seafood products have been testing high for cesium-137 based upon a contamination event that occurred in a certain area in Indonesia. Jeez. So FDA just recently issued a certification requirement, but that's not microbiology, right? That's radiation exposure. So It could be a number of things. So the food safety program is designed to, it's not a preventative program, right? It's not, I'm going to prevent the food from becoming contaminated. This is my intention to prevent contamination failed, and it's out, right? The horses are out of the barn, and I'm trying to track the horses down. And I want to figure out what barn it came from, which barns it came through, and where the horses are, and get them under control. And that's what's going on. So it's more of an emergency, right? The result is that the people who interact with the government, when there's an event that requires the documentation to be presented, like you can't create the documentation when the government shows up, because you're supposed to have it. And the reason you're supposed to have it is because it's an emergency when they need it, right? So they're not waiting around for you to create the documents. They're going to do a pretty intensive interview and try to figure out who else they got to go to see if they can find the next document link. And they'll deal with you later. The Uyghur program, the customs program, the forced labor program, is enforcing trade law, international trade law with respect to the treatment of workers. So this is a forced labor. Can be child labor. It can be prison labor. It can be labor. It's very common. It's labor. It can be undocumented worker labor. There's a lot of it actually. Well, I'm not gonna say a lot of it. There is forced labor in the United States, and without question. And so that's a form of forced labor. Now, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act is different than other statutes in that Congress was presented with sufficient evidence to become satisfied that certain regions in China where the forced labor was so ingrained in those regions that Congress established wrote the statute. It was signed into law, and it basically creates a presumption. The presumption that if your product, this is not just food, now we're talking everything, right? Any cotton, pharmaceuticals, cardboard used for packaging, you name it, anything that goes through that region or is associated with that region. And there's some other pieces to it also, but is going to be presumed to have been made with forced labor. This can include services associated with the production of product, right? That's why services is in the question, because it's not just product is product, that's things you touch, right? But there's a lot of services that are necessary to manufacture a product. And those services could actually be performed under forced labor or in the region. So in those cases, if customs is asking for your documents, it's not an emergency at the time, right? The emergency happened when forced labor occurred. Rather, this is penalty. This is punishment for companies that are participating without knowledge of their supply chains, whether they're food companies, right? This is the overlap. They could be food companies. They could be medical device companies or pharmaceutical companies. That's the FDA overlap. Customs doesn't care if it's anybody or any product that has a connection association with the relevant provinces. Then it's going to be stopped, and then the importer is going to have to prove that the cargo, that the origins and the sources of the services and the raw materials do not have a connection with those regions, or else the goods are getting destroyed. So it's not exported, right? Those goods are going to be destroyed. So it's a completely different approach for a completely different reason with different impacts. They do overlap in that they both have effects on FDA regulated industry. Customs manages all forced labor. It's like a statutory restriction on importation, as opposed to there's other forced laborers also, but that's not it's not specific to the Uyghurs. And then FDA is primarily looking at food safety and trying to contain risks with respect to the actual food. Right, the imported product didn't violate the law when it was manufactured in accordance with forced labor. Right, the goods are not in violation of the law. They were made in an illegal way that Congress enforces with a presumption. Right, in FDA, the goods violate the law, right, because the goods are not safe. So consequently, the approaches are quite different.
So Ben, what types of records are companies now expected to maintain to satisfy the FDA's and the CBP's expectations?
Yeah. So let's start with customs. And this is true whether it's goods coming, goods that might be subject to UFLPA or not. Any forced labor is a violation, right? So it doesn't have to be under the Uyghur Protection Act. There is a generalized statute that prevents the importation of goods that have been manufactured, or the standard is actually lower than actually have been manufactured, but it's like an appearance standard, like that there's evidence that would indicate that the goods were manufactured with forced labor, and that doesn't matter where it's coming from. Right, it's not necessarily China. It could be, in fact, and then customs issues withhold release orders, which says any products coming from a particular company or a particular region or a particular fleet, in terms of like a fishing vessels, are going to automatically be detained, and that's based upon a specific investigation customs has conducted about that supply chain. Any importer needs to have documentation and verification from their foreign supplier that the foreign suppliers also are ensuring that their supply chains do not contain, there's no forced labor in their supply chains. And that documentation is going to be, with respect to the Uyghur Protection Act, where did my goods come from? Can I trace my goods all the way back to the farm? Can I trace my goods all the way back to the smelting pot that was used in order to manufacture the material that was used to manufacture the component that was going into the medical device? Right, that level of detail. And customs is looking for a excruciating level of detail to overcome the assumption, right, the presumption that the goods were made with forced labor. And in the food space, it depends upon what you do with the food, right? So FDA has created this sort of regime that says there are certain sort of key activities that critical tracing events, they call them CTEs. The government loves acronyms, right? So CTEs, critical tracing elements or events, and those are things like I perform a manufacturing step. I've just triggered the need to trace because I'm the one that did the kill step. And then FDA came up with these key data elements that would need to be collected at each of the various events, right? And the data is related to the risk associated with the event. So the manufacturing event is a high risk event. If it fails, then you have a risk of a lot of food becoming contaminated, right? However, if it's a storage facility and on a certain day, your reefer or your refrigerator goes out, you've got a much narrower risk with respect to impact, right? Because it's just the foods that were in the freezer at the time. So that gives you an example. So the data that has to be collected is going to be connected to the event that makes it a traceability event. And this is all outlined in the FDA's regs, and they've got a chart for it and everything else. It looks very convoluted, but it actually is pretty intuitive if you're in the food space or the distribution space. So an example. In almost every instance, you have to know who the person was, the company that sent you the food or the ingredient or the raw material or whatever, where they are, where it came from. You need to have the lot number associated with that food if there is one, when you got it, where you put it, what did you do with it, who got it next, right? And so that's basically it. It's and your documentation, and then depending upon whether you are a key step in terms of preventing risk, then you also are going to have lot level traceability, right? So this is going down to the lot. Your lot numbering system is going to be built into your traceability so that the agency is capable of going after the lots. That's different than pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Medical devices and pharmaceuticals go down to the unit, right? Because it's possible that you can have an adverse event associated with a single patient and a single unit that's not really about the fact that the product is defective. It's something else, right? With food, the expectation would be the lot would be the same across the lot. It would be uniform. So they go down to the lot level. So it's a lot of documentation. Now, in the case of UFLPA, if your cargo, really any forced labor, you're going to know when the cargo hits the border because customs is going to detain the cargo. And you're going to have the opportunity to start presenting documentation to the government. That's the wrong time to collect your documents because customs is not waiting around. You've got about 30 days. Customs has about 30 days to move from a detention to a seizure and to start processing that thing through the program. And you have to get to customs with the records as soon as you can to demonstrate that your cargo is not, in fact, affected by forced labor. In the food space, you need to have your documentation now also because if there's a problem, FDA is going to be angry when they get there and you don't have the documents because they wouldn't be there if there hadn't been a food safety event that resulted in people in the hospital and maybe being dead. So they're not interested in anything other than compliance at that stage. And apologies won't make them happy. So this documentation needs to be available. And you can see if you're an importer of food, right, you have overlapped obligations. Now, if you add seafood to that, then you also have another importation monitoring program that has documentation that goes back to the catch location, the vessel, right? It's very, and that's for conservation purposes, and sort of like overfishing and gathering and harvesting seafood in places which is dangerous, right? It's not healthy, or using equipment that does danger to other species. So you can see how all these different traceability things, which we're not done. Right, we're just touching the surface. So the one thing is that you got to know how many of them that impact you. It's really important to know how many of these things impact you. And if you're importing product, then forced labor impacts you. Although that probably is easier to sort of project yourself away by staying in certain markets. Although tomatoes from Mexico, certain tomatoes from Mexico were subject to a forced labor withhold release order. So you got to look, you got to check. With the FDA space, FDA doesn't care where it's coming from. They care about what you're doing with it, where you got it, and where you sent it. So that's about what you're doing with the food and what the risks are with the food. But you got to know these things, or you're going to have a problem when the government starts looking for the records.
So Ben, before we wrap things up, we talked about a lot of things. We got to try to get to a lot of things. What's one thing you can give people to take away from this episode about all the things and all the intricacies that we talked about?
Yeah, and don't let it make you stop importing food, because we still have to eat. All right. The fact of the matter is, right, the majority of food that's consumed in the country is not manufactured here. We've got a large agricultural industry, but we don't actually have a large food manufacturing industry to feed 365 million people. So we actually import a tremendous amount of food, including a lot of fresh produce coming out of Mexico, coming out of South and Central America, frozen foods coming from Europe, coming from China, from Asia, all over. So the answer is that you've got to understand that these requirements are in effect, right? So FSMA 204 is already in effect. Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act has been in effect for a couple of years. The section of the statute that governs general forced labor has been in effect for years. SIMP is expanding, right? The seafood import monitoring program. So you already are subject to it, and so you're behind the eight ball if you haven't already identified what you need to be doing and start doing it. The other thing I would say is so know what your responsibilities are. Know which jurisdictions are subject to your food, and your processes are subject to which jurisdictions and which statutes. And then read the guidances. It's hard for me to tell you what to do without another podcast, right? But you need to get somebody who knows how to do this in the door. They can be consultants. The government recognizes that people need to use outside consultants to do this work. We do this work. I've got people that I actually have done food safety inspections, trace backs. I was at the FDA for 17 years. So, I've actually traced back food and done that epidemiological work at the FDA. So I know how the FDA thinks about it and the documents are looking for. You want to find somebody like that to help you.
Wow. Benjamin, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks. Good to talk to you, Evan. And hopefully this doesn't scare anybody away.
Yeah, don't be scared, guys. That's it for today's episode of FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance. If your business needs help strengthening its supply chain documentation or meeting the new FDA and customs traceability requirements, connect with Ben and his team at FDAImports.com. And if you found this information helpful, I am sure that you did. Please like, share, subscribe, and give it to someone that might find it helpful as well. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.